Hi everyone, this is Rob Watson. This is the module overview, the overview video for the, I can't get my words out, the lecture, which is the 18th lecture for TECH1502 Introduction to Community Media. There, I got there. And this is, the title of this lecture is Community Cohesion. Community cohesion. So what I want to talk about is kind of some of the kind of models, if you like, of what makes a cohesive society, what makes a cohesive community. And I'm going to draw on some of my personal experience and kind of illustrate this with some examples of kind of the period of time that I grew up in Liverpool and kind of the long-term effect of a very dysfunctional social arrangement in that city at the time, I suppose. But what I'll talk about is there's a kind of context to thinking through about accounts of community, and that the idea that we have of what community is changes and shifts depending on the circumstances, depending on the people who are involved, depending on the time, depending on the kind of forms of technology that we use to facilitate it, and that it doesn't stay the same. So our argument about what forms a sense of community has to be considered in a number of multiply layered or interacting kind of ways and processes. And there's some indicators, if you like, that are used as a kind of strength, to tell us about the how strong a community is. And there's things like expectations about your lifespan and people's lifespan, expectations about poverty, expectations about industrialization, expectations about deprivation and the relative levels of deprivation and poverty that people experience in the context of those who are not deprived, if you like. So what we'll look at is kind of issues to do with things like the concentration of poverty in some communities, the decline of neighbourliness, the kind of and these things are often based on a set of assumptions, a kind of what a term kind of foundational assumptions, whereby we base the decisions that we take and the policies that we put forward and the availability of resources and access to those resources on the basis of, if you like, a moral or political or emotional argument, which then drives and shapes the kind of political debate. And there's a kind of a challenge, I think, in terms of figuring out what are the intended and the unintended consequences, because whilst you might be attempting to achieve something for a progressive reason, you might thereby compound a negative and regressive social situation, or vice versa. And it's kind of how do we figure out what is the right kind of response? And this is something that has challenged government over many years, and the whole process of what informs a sense of community regeneration and a kind of what enables us to overcome the sense of social exclusion that some people experience, but also in the context of thinking, we've had a political system over the last few decades which has dismantled any kind of sense of welfare support that people might otherwise be able to rely on and depend on. And really it's kind of like how the questions are raised, and people like George Monbiot are raising this question, who writes for The Guardian, about how we can, communities can take back control and offer something which is suited to their needs and their independent needs, rather than it just being, if you like, a political slogan which is generated. So how do communities work for themselves? And so we'll look at some examples of things like time banking, which is it's a crowdsourcing kind of approach to alternative social engagement and economy, based on the idea of reciprocation and sharing, but it uses a model based on information platforms to be able to manage that process. And then also looking at things like different kind of forms of community, which are maybe more suited to a kind of more engaging and positive and creative form of expression, rather than just leaving things to be kind of woe is us, the world is falling apart. Well, what can we do? What can we do to bring people together in a more creative and engaging kind of approach, rather than just relying on a kind of waiting for the government to turn up and solve our problems for us? So the whole kind of shift, if you like, and this is something that we'll be looking at in more detail in year 2, is that kind of, you've got the relationship between what it means to be a community builder. It's people who facilitate and support the development of community and provide the infrastructure for communities. Then you've got the kind of community bridging, so you're bringing communities together in different ways, and what facilitates that. And you've got a kind of sense of community action. This is not just about talking about things, but this is about doing things. And fundamentally, what is the role of community media in this process? How can community media facilitate building, bridging, and action? So that's the kind of discussion that we want to have going forward, and you might put in your evaluation for your written work and your project work. So the notes are up on DMU Commons Wiki. Just go to wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk. And if you want to carry on the conversation, hop over to Talk, which is talk.our.dmu.ac.uk. See you at the lecture.